Um, well, yeah. So if you're ready to get started, let's see if we can maybe do this in 45 minutes to an hour or so.
That would be great.
I say that because based on my previous conversations, that's about 6 questions.
Yeah, my stamina is less than it was, and I may draw blanks on some of these. I mean, I think a lot of people weighed in with all sorts of opinions, but I think there are more unknowns than there are known unknowns at this point, or known knowns, or whatever. It's pretty murky right now, so we'll see.
So, I plan on posting this to YouTube, and I may do an article about it. Are both those okay?
Sure. Yeah.
All right. So I guess I actually got a suggested question from Twitter. I don't know if you saw it. Someone said, "Is there anything Joe Biden can do with executive orders, or does it all have to be done with the DOJ?" That's more or less his question verbatim.
Beyond my scope, above my pay grade, I really don't know. I mean, I think he already has, made some use of executive orders for certain things. I don't know how far that can go. I think that the conventional approach has been litigious. In other words, having the DOJ challenge legislation or challenge regulations or whatever they are, as either being in some way violations of federal legislation like the Voting Rights Act or the Constitution. And the problem with that is that, it tends to be a pretty slow boat. Sometimes the litigation is expedited. Sometimes it has to be because there's an election coming up and there's deadlines. But as we've seen, even with the census, recently the 3-judge panel came out on the census. There's a real, things generally move through courts really slowly. And when you have elections, you have a time frame that can make that very frustrating. So there is certainly the temptation to use another tool, and that could be executive orders. I just don't think, I mean, given how traditionally a matter of state and county prerogative elections have been, if we're talking about executive orders that, for instance, overrule some of these new laws that have come into place that are basically voter suppression schemes, I don't think that's going to fly. I think that has to be federal legislation, and obviously that's in trouble.
I think you're right on that, but I wanted to ask because it's the only Twitter involvement that kind of pre-engaged. The second question I have is, we talked about, I told you I was going to ask about this, is what I don't understand, and I'm hoping you can explain it to me, is how you said exit polls are merged with the actual results. So after a couple of hours, you really can't use them to analyze the election.
Yeah, so there are, I guess, a few terms of art that are helpful to understand. I mean, one is when exit polls or any polls are taken, you have the raw data, you have the responses on the questionnaires that are simply tallied up. If the question is, do you think the economy is going in the right direction? Yes, no, maybe, whatever, those responses are tallied, along with, do you consider yourself a Democrat, Republican? What is your, do you approve or disapprove of the job so-and-so is doing? I mean, the exit polls often have a long form and a short form, and the long form is quite long, could run 40, 50 questions. So there's a lot of information on there. And that raw data, the exit pollsters will tell you, cannot be relied upon for any indication of what is what the opinions actually are of the country or the state or whatever is being measured. And that's because exit polling is notoriously difficult to weight. It's notoriously difficult to get a random sample. And so they don't really get a random sample. They select certain precincts, and that's done with a weighting factor in terms of what their partisanship is, historical partisanship, and even individual questionnaires wind up getting weighted so that they can have the right proportion of voters of color, rich, poor, whatever the stratifications are. So basically, they're taking a very well-informed guess about what the electorate looks like: men, women, young, old, black, white, Latino, et cetera, and also Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal. And so once that weighting takes place, that's the first numbers that we will see posted have been weighted. They're not the raw data. We don't get to see the raw data, but we do get to see these weighted numbers. And as the votes come, and usually those weighted numbers are posted within minutes, just a minute or two, sometimes seconds, of the official closing time of the polls. So we regard that as, what can I say, quasi-pristine, as pristine as we're going to get, the best we're going to get, in terms of it not being tainted by actual vote counts. But the presumption in the United States, this is not true elsewhere in the world, but the presumption in the United States is that the vote counts are accurate. And therefore, if the exit polls don't match the vote counts, what use are they going to be in terms of academic and scholastic analysis, the punditry? How are they going to get an accurate read on what women under 30 wanted, or, you know, what, let's say Biden's approval was among independents, right? If the exit polls are off, and by definition off means they don't match the vote counts. Yep.
My phone overheated a bit. I'm not sure if so. The last thing I heard was about that the U.S., but not the rest of the world, takes these election results as being more accurate than the exit polls.
Oh, you're gonna have to pay me extra for this one. So let me, I guess I'll back up to, because there was about 5 minutes more of babbling on. Let me go back to that point and recapitulate, I guess, and then you'll be able to edit out if it appears twice. So in the US, unlike in other countries, there's basically a rock solid presumption, at least among the poobahs, that the vote counts are correct. And therefore, if there's a disparity between the vote counts and the exit polls or the pre-election polls or any poll, the polls must be off. There must be some sort of bias, selection bias, response bias, shy Trump respondents not responding or lying or whatever it might be, some factor. And so, and some of that, whoops, you disappeared again. Can you hear me now?
I can still hear you.
Okay, good. Some of that, those factors are worth looking into. I mean, they're not made up out of thin air. There are difficulties reaching certain kinds of voters. It's more difficult reaching, you know, center city urban voters. It's more difficult sometimes reaching far out rural voters. And so that's why the polls, the exit polls in particular, are heavily stratified. They're weighted to try to approximate a very well-informed view of what the electorate looked like in terms of gender, race, political persuasion, age, wealth, you know, demographics in general. But because the poobahs believe that if there's a disparity between the exit poll and the vote counts, then the exit polls must be off. then they're not going to be very useful, those exit polls, for all the analysis that the pundits like to do, which is, what was Biden's approval among independents, let's say, or how did women under 30 vote on a certain, how did they feel about a certain issue like gun ownership or something like that. So they want to look at all these aspects of the electorate, and they feel that if the exit poll doesn't match the vote count, there's something wrong with the exit poll, so they're going to get a distorted view of the electorate. So therefore, they begin interpolating in from basically the moment the polls close, actual vote counts. And it's a complex algorithm, and it's computerized, and it runs through all sorts of computer networks that we don't know all that much about. But the bottom line is, bit by bit, course of several adjustments, by the next day, the exit polls, which then become immortalized, those were the exit polls for that election, they wind up congruent with the vote counts, or very nearly congruent with the vote counts, and therefore useless as any sort of baseline verification check mechanism. And of course, that's what we're interested in. We're trying to get collect data to look at the validity of the vote counts and see if there are any egregious red flags, anomalous patterns that require further looking into. So therefore, we grab those unadjusted exit polls as soon as they're posted. And that's often within a minute or two of the poll closing. We have difficulty in certain states, like classic examples are Florida and Michigan, where a tiny little part of the state is in a time zone to the west of the rest of the state. And therefore, the polls there don't close for an extra hour. And guess what? They don't post, at least in presidential years, they don't post the exit polls for that additional hour. And because votes are counted quickly by computer, by the time that hour's gone by, they've counted about 50, 60% of the vote. And you're going to see exit polls that are very, very close to the vote counts, because those vote counts are being thrown in algorithmically with the exit poll results, and they're adjusting them basically to congruence with the vote counts. So when we see a significant disparity between the exit polls and the vote counts, the poll we're using is a weighted poll. It's the pollster's best estimation of the composition of the electorate, and there's a lot of data goes into that estimation. Now, does that get more difficult when you have COVID and you have mail, a lot of vote by mail? Yeah, it does. And a lot of people were saying, well, it's not even an exit poll because people aren't going to the polls to vote. The exit pollsters, they're not dumb and they're not helpless. They always have done a fair number of remote interviews, because there's always been a certain amount of absentee and mail-in voting, and they've wanted to capture those. They've just expanded that for the 2020 election. And they used various means to try to make sure in their weighting that they're getting a fair representation of the electorate. And when the exit polls and the tracking polls are very much aligned and are very much congruent, which is what we saw in 2020, it gives a lot of support to that as a measure of the electorate and as a measure of how the electorate said it was going to vote. Another form of way we can validate the exit polls, and this came out very clearly in 2020, when we looked at the exit polls and the tracking polls for president in 2020, and actually for nationally for other races as well, covering the House races and whatnot. But those exit polls, the ones that were taken nationally, and the tracking polls that tracked the national vote, they had as one of their measures, the unadjusted exit poll, as one of their measure, Trump approval. And the Trump approval in that poll was somewhere, I actually have it here, I'm going to look it up because it was, it's worth noting what it was. Yeah, in the exit poll, it was 46%, his approval rating in the exit poll. So whoever they exit polled nationally, whatever that group consisted of, they approved of Trump collectively at 46%. And we all know that his approval rating was very, very stable and very solid for months before the election. And it ranged from, 39 to 42, 43%. That was kind of on the high side. So a 46% approval rating tells you that this group that you are asking how they voted is not a bunch of reluctant non-respondents, for Trump voters that didn't want to respond. However, they voodooed it and weighted it. They've gotten a group that likes Trump more than any other measure had shown the American voting public liking Trump. So if anything, the bias of that poll was in favor of Donald Trump and in favor of Republican candidates. And that's a pretty important and strong validation. We came up with similar tools that we used in 2004, 2006. We've used them in the past. And when you see things like that, prior vote for president or approval rating, and they stand out, and you see that they're either tracking very well with all the other measures that have been taken by all these diverse opinion surveys, or they are even more to the right, they're to the right of that baseline, that tells you that you've got, at the very worst, you've got a valid poll. And in all likelihood, you have a poll that is already shifted red. Then when the vote counts are to the right of that poll, that tells you damn well better look at the vote counts and find out what went on.
That makes sense. I mean, that's like, I just don't, it's just so frustrating that they merged the exit polls and the voting results. Like, why bother doing it? You have two separate pieces of data, which, accurate, inaccurate, you got two data points, and at the end of the day, you have one data point.
Yeah, no, it's frustrating in a way, but because it would be more than frustrating. It would be very, very, very suspect if they didn't post that initial exit poll and we didn't get our hands on that data, or if people like me, didn't screen capture that data. I mean, since 2004, we tried in 2002. The exit polls were not posted in 2002 because they were so far off. But starting in 2004, I mean, that's how I basically broke into this racket. At that point, I didn't have a screen capture tool and I didn't know what a PDF was. I mean, I just printed these things out on my printer and printed out like 370 pages worth of exit poll crosstabs. But because we're able to capture that data, it's really just, I guess it's deceptive for people who don't want to look into it any deeper. And they say, oh, well, the exit polls matched. Or occasionally you'll find a reporter who say, well, the election must have been, perfectly fine because the exit polls matched. And they're looking at adjusted exit polls. That does still happen, but most reporters are more savvy than that. And most analysts are more savvy than that. So, they're doing it because if you believe the vote counts are accurate, then you want exit polls that match the vote counts so that all the demographics and all the information you get out of the exit polls is also accurate. That's the plausible deniability, the reason given for why they do the adjustment. Fortunately, the adjustment is not yet fatal. If they stop posting early unadjusted exit polls, then it really will be fatal. They really would have taken away our, one of our key baselines. But let's keep in mind, US House races are not individually exit polled. So, on those, we have to look at tracking polls and we have to look at historical and archival patterns and such as that. So we don't even always have exit polls to work with. They're very, very helpful. They unfortunately, are controversial, but sometimes we have to work, with other data.
Sure. Well, that's my questions. I guess my answer is more a general question. So I know you've been looking at the forensics for the past few months. What can you tell us about 2020? What do you think is interesting to share?
Yeah, I've delayed, procrastinated, I guess is a better word, coming out with a write-up and an analytical write-up, because so much has been going on and the environment has been so fraught, obviously, with the Stop the Steal business and what's going on in Arizona and all that. It's been, a very overheated environment, and frankly, an environment very, very hostile to any forensic suggestions that elections have not been, the perfect or, the best, the most secure election in our history or whatever. So, after 20 years of basically banging my head against the spiked wall of, media dismissal and being treated like a conspiracy theorist, basically. This was not, the spikes on this wall were even longer and sharper. So I've put it off, but I've finally gotten around to it. I sent you a copy of an early draft. It's a work in progress. And basically what really stands out about this election is that the headlines would be the question, did Biden steal the election? Or, was a sacred landslide stolen from Trump? That's what got all the coverage. That's what got all the oxygen. That's what got people to storm the Capitol. And the forensics basically all go in the opposite direction. And by that, I mean that when you look at the exit polls and you look at the tracking polls, and it gets a little more sophisticated when you start looking at other measures, but just those, which are very commonly available, and anybody can go and basically look them up, and it's basically an apples to apples comparison of vote share at, in the official returns versus vote share in the polls. You see the exact opposite flow. You see, and this election was basically a disaster for Democrats from the neck down. Biden won, but the gains that the Democrats expected in the House turned into major losses. They did not succeed in taking the Senate until Trump basically handed it to them in Georgia. So they weren't going to get the Senate without Trump's, I presume, unwitting help and bungling. So that would have been a disappointment. And state legislatures where they expected to make significant pickups, even in states like Texas, maybe gaining a state house in traditionally red states, they actually lost ground. They lost two chambers, and they lost a couple of trifectas as well. The Republicans now have complete control of two more states than they had. And this is with a major, major popular vote win by Biden. Popular vote means, nationwide, doesn't necessarily correlate with the Electoral College, as we've seen, but it should correlate with results down ballot, unless there's an extraordinary amount of ticket splitting. So, Biden wound up having negative coattails, and we don't see negative coattails in presidential elections, and certainly not in first-term presidential elections. We just don't see them. So this is, again, something that, stands out. It's this big anomaly. So when you look at the overall picture, the exit polls and the tracking polls, and by tracking polls, I mean all sorts of different diverse polling organizations, from Rasmussen to Monmouth to New York Times to they're all taking a crack at it, right? EPP, there are several dozen reputable, semi-reputable polling organizations, and these results have been graded, weighted, aggregated, and those are the tracking polls that we relied on. We basically look at the tracking polls every day going up to the election, with November 3rd being, the last set of tracking polls. Tracking polls and exit polls both had Biden winning the popular vote by between 12.5 and 13 million vote margin. Now he won by 7. So that leaves a lot of votes with a big question mark. What happened? What happened here that made these votes shift or disappear or whatever? People were telling what their preferences were, and then they were attempting to cast those votes and have them counted, and something was different between what they were expressing and what wound up being counted as their votes. And it's a big whopping difference. I mean, 5 to 6 million votes is a lot of votes. So that was one indicator. And then we had, the famous House races. We had the Cook report and the New York Times identifying 27 toss-up House races, which means they go either way, of which the Republicans took, wait for it, 27. They went 27 for 27 in toss-ups. And I know you've done some work on this. And, from a random standpoint, if you regard a toss-up as flipping a penny, that would happen 1 in several hundred million times. This is not a very likely scenario, going 27 for 27. It's like basically, you flip a penny and it comes up heads 27 times in a row. You could spend thousands and thousands of lifetimes flipping that penny before you came up with that pattern, right? Maybe millions.
I tried to find a good analogy to that probability, and it's the same probability as basically dying while playing a board game.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, and again, some people are in love with big numbers. Richard Charnan used to like to trot out, 10 to the minus 39, or Avogadro's number, or, Planck's constant. I have a limited appreciation for all that, because the bottom line is this was not random. You are comparing, what made them call something a toss-up was predictive data. So they were looking at polls. And if those polls were flawed, and they were flawed in a fundamental way that undercounted Republican vote, then of course those toss-ups are not really toss-ups. And the fact that Republicans took all of them is not 1 in 100 and some odd million. So the big numbers can be, they're fun, but they don't really get to the question of where does the problem lie? Did we have a systemic? What it does tell us is this doesn't happen by chance. We either have a systemic failing on the polling side, or we have some sort of systemic failure on the vote counting side, possibly a mixture of the two. But it tells you that something's wrong with this picture.
Well, I went back to 2008 through 2020 because there was a Wikipedia section for toss-up races, and they do not break down as you might like a coin top would be between 50 and 60. They tend to swing between 63 and 73%, going one side or another, which makes sense because, like you said, the law in the polling, it's going to go one way or another. But they all had predictive explanations, like good years for Republicans, 73% for them, good years for Democrats, 73% for them, between 60 and 73%, whatever swing you would have. What you don't have is 2020, which is a miserable year for the Republican brand, and 100%. There's nothing like 100%. The maximum was 73% for the other years, and it was never against the public tide of opinion.
Yeah, that was very good work you did on that, because again, this is how election forensics should be done. You got to look for, because we don't get access unless you happen to be the cyber ninjas in Maricopa County. You don't get access to hard evidence. You've got to go out and grab every bit of evidence you can. And that's a perfect example of it, where you look at archival patterns and you say, okay, this is how it generally breaks. And now we have this radical departure from this. How do we explain it? And I mean, when you spin the brain a little, and one possible explanation is that Trump was horrifically unpopular. And so Biden did a whole lot better against Trump than Democratic down ballot candidates did against Republicans, their Republican opponents, because a lot of people came out and voted against Trump, but that doesn't mean they were voting against Republican, other Republican candidates. A plausible hypothesis, no proof, not even better than 50-50. We don't know. I mean, this is why I said at the very beginning that a lot of this, is still very muddy and may remain so. But yeah, this was a big departure from anything we've seen in the past. It was a big departure from the polls, and it basically remains unexplained. Can it happen? Could there be organic factors? Yes. When we looked at these 27 toss-ups, we found, and actually what we did is we looked at flipped seats, because it wasn't just the toss-ups. There were 5 or 6, maybe 7 seats that were rated as leaning Democratic that the Republicans managed to pick off. And that's also pretty rare for that to happen. And I should say, none of the seats that were rated leaning Republican did a Republican lose. They won everything on their side. And they picked off some Democrats and they took all the toss-ups. That's the pattern. And so when we looked at the ones that were predicted for Democrats and then wound up flipping in the House, the top 5 are all ES&S counted, election systems and software, which is the voting equipment vendor that the Republicans never touched with a 10-foot pole. They went after Dominion, hammer and tong. They were going to put Dominion out of business. Now they're getting countersued. But ES&S, never heard of them. And they count the plurality of votes in this country. They have a significantly bigger market share than Dominion, and the two of them together count about 80% of the votes. Add in Hart Intercivic, and you got 90% of the votes. But if you ask a Republican, it's ES&S who? And yet you looked at the top 5 flipped House seats. What do they have in common? They're all ES&S equipment. Coincidence? Maybe. Worth looking into? Yes. Can you look into it? That's where it gets sticky. A lot of these places, ballots are not public record, or if they are public record, you have to pay rather exorbitantly to get your hands on them, which is what makes what is happening in Arizona mind F for those of us who have been at this for 20 years, because every election, we actually did the work. We'd sit at the computers, we'd look at these patterns, and you've done some of this work now. You know what it entails. You got to go look at charts and compare them and try to figure out what might be happening. And so election after election, we've done that, and we've seen election after election that there's this virtually unidirectional shift when 2 parties are involved. We'll leave the primaries out of this. That gets hairy and complicated. But when there's Democrat and Republican, red shift, and the vote counts come out to the right of the polls, whether exit or tracking or both, consistently. And not only that, there's a differential between competitive elections with national significance, like the Maine Senate election, for instance, right? Or some of these House elections that will determine in 2022 whether there's a House majority or not. I mean, it's relatively few elections are competitive and bear national significance. Very small percentage of the elections, because the rest are all safe. They're all gerrymandered, or they're in deep red or deep blue states for president, and they're not competitive. You're not going to steal the state of Washington or the state of California or the state of Nebraska. I mean, those are off the charts as far as election theft is concerned. So what we saw was that when elections, when we were able to compare a competitive set of elections, in other words, if the criteria for these elections are, they'd be really appealing to an operative, a Karl Rove, for instance, to actually, dig into these elections over here. But these over here, no, they wouldn't be interested in. And if that was the dividing line, competitive versus non-competitive, national significance versus no national significance, we found that the red shift exhibited a significant differential. We saw, and then 2016 is a classic example of that, where the battleground states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Ohio, Michigan and Florida are separate because, as I said, they're 2 time zones, and the exit polls are mitigated, pre-adjusted basically before first public posting. But even in Florida, there was a significant red shift. We saw this big red shift in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, in North Carolina, in Ohio. And the national exit poll was pretty close to spot on. It had a 1% shift. Ohio had 8%, North Carolina 5.7%, Wisconsin, if I remember correctly, 5.6 or 5.4%, Pennsylvania, same thing. So I call that a second order comparative, right? You've got a disparity of disparities. You look at these elections over here, they don't count for anything. And yeah, the polls look pretty good there. And you go over here where it's for all the marbles, and all of a sudden you got this red shift. That's pretty powerful forensic evidence. And we would come up with that kind of analysis year in and year out and get absolutely nowhere with trying to take it to the next level of actually looking at examining hard evidence, open up an op scan, look at the ballots. Do they match the tally, the computerized tally for that op scan? Look at a county total, count all the ballots in that county as they're doing in Maricopa, but you might pick a smaller county. So you don't have 2.1 million ballots to deal with, and count all the ballots and look at the county totals. Do they match? Was there chain of custody of these ballots? To get actual hard evidence, can we look at the code in the machines? Can we have a forensic examination of the machines? And the answer was always no. I mean, Jill Stein got what were supposed to be recounts. They were all thwarted in various ways and incomplete, at best, incomplete. So we couldn't get anything. And then the Stop the Steal movement comes along, these Republicans who we pretty much grasp at this point are desperate, demographically desperate. They know that their days are numbered if we have legitimate elections. They know that if people actually are allowed to vote, they're screwed. And if the votes are counted accurately and honestly, they're screwed. And they know that going in. So, naturally, they're going to pull out all the stops. What do you see? They get their hands unilaterally, ex parte, no adversarial supervision. And Pache to Ray Lutz and John Brakey, who were on site and got to see some things. But the bottom line is, they've had those ballots for months, and they've had 24 hours in every day to do things to those ballots and count them in basically any which way they want. And now Ray is doing battle to, get a hold of the digital ballot images to try to do what amounts to an audit of the audit, or a check on the audit count and on the original count of ballots. So, all of a sudden they have access to 2.1 million ballots, essentially unsupervised. In the beginning, the media couldn't get in. The only media that could get in was OANN. So, it was like, okay, here, take these ballots to your castle and do whatever you please with them, and then come out with a report at the end and say whatever it is you decided you were going to say to begin with. This is crazy. This is absolutely crazy. And it makes you, in a funny kind of way, understand why we got nowhere all those years. Because the guardians of election protocol and whatnot don't want this kind of crazy. Now, they may have legitimate reasons for not wanting this kind of crazy. They do. And they may also not want this kind of crazy because they're hiding all sorts of things. We don't know that. All we know is that we who came at this essentially nonpartisan, I mean, I mean, yes, individually we might be partisans, but quite a few of the election, integrity people were nonpartisan. Lynn Landis, Garland Favorito, they lean libertarian or they lean right, very different part of the spectrum from people like me. And we were completely denied access. And all of a sudden, Donald Trump comes along and they break the mold and they're sitting there counting all these ballots and doing whatever they're going to do with these ballots. I personally am terrified for this country that they are going to come out and say, well, Donald Trump won Arizona. That's the headline. Whatever the details are, however they got there, whatever counting voodoo they did to get there, that's going to be buried in, paragraph 17. But there are people out there that stormed the Capitol, and there are people out there, millions of people, who are true believers in stop the steal and no longer trust our election system, which might work out to be a good thing, but I don't see the road ahead as being a good road, because we could wind up with something that makes January 6th look like, a picnic. And this is scary. And I got to say, it's one of those things where you just left kind of scratching your head and saying, how could this flip this way? How could we work all these years? And then when finally there's access granted, it's in this obviously a way that's less transparent and at least as suspect as the counting process itself. And we're still, even more so now, being told to sit down and shut up if we present the kind of forensics that I was talking to you about, where we're looking at these patterns, these unlikely patterns, and there are a couple of others that really corroborate that and corroborate it in a way that is not based on polling. And if we come forward with that, the danger is that it just gives fuel to this idea that, that nothing can be trusted. And it is hard to defend the trustworthiness and the legitimacy of our election system. It's almost indefensible. But after elections come riots, and you take elections away and you've got revolution. And I'm a liberal, but I'm not a revolutionary. It's a scary phase to go through, especially when there are 380 million guns floating around the country. I don't really have the stomach for a revolution. And so you want to see some repair of trust. And right now, I do not see how we get there.
Well, I think I'm more pro-revolution than you are, in the sense that, suppose your hypothesis is right, that, in 2016, let's say that they went to the bat with a corked bat, and that Hillary should have been president and wasn't. And what follows from that is, all the environmental damage that has happened from deregulation, the people who died and got deported, and just the fact that we didn't have a democracy for 4 years. To the extent that we have one now, I think the big element is the person selected president by the votes become president. And when that doesn't happen, then you either have two choices. You either live under an authoritarian regime, dress up however you like. Oh, they didn't take power by military. They just took power by a fake election. It's the same result. Someone imposed a ruler upon you.
Yeah, I mean, I share some of that feeling. It's a hard place. I mean, I don't think there's, I don't think there's a slam dunk here. I certainly don't feel it, you know, a slam dunk on my side. I get pulled both ways. I don't know, you know, I've often said that our greatest power as a people is a latent power. And, you know, it's our power to spend or not to spend. It's our power as consumers, you know, and that we have that direct possibility for, you know, reining in and bringing back a political system that's kind of run amok. Now, within the political system, I mean, yeah, there's the presidency and there's the executive branch, and, you know, that leads to things like the Supreme Court and all that. That's an important center of gravity. It's not the only one. There's centers of gravity, you know, in executive, administrative, and legislative, really right down to cities and counties and towns. And I think a lot of that works reasonably well. Unfortunately, where we've gotten to, and this has, I think it's in part has to do with the maladaptation of our constitutional framework to this particular historical moment in time. And a lot of it has to do with the media and the change in media and whatnot. So we're in a position where a lot of administrative and judicial and governmental functions actually kind of work. There are a lot of good people doing their best to and not corrupt and trying to do good things. I'd say the majority, you know, the vast majority of them. Unfortunately, we've arrived at a time that is so stoked and so polarized, and you know, where the lies have been spewed and are continuing to be spewed, that, and they're lies and they're lies. And, you know, I accept a certain amount of lying from government. I mean, it's a game. You gotta, the public is the enemy. This is the truth. I mean, in many ways, the public is the enemy. They want to know too much. We want to know all sorts of things. And we can't have this diplomacy if everything is known and all our cards are on the table and all that. So it's always been that way. There's always been this concealment that's gone on. And to a certain extent, and this is where I'm more moderate than some of my, you know, colleagues and friends and whatnot, but I accept that. I accept that, you know, you get to be a certain age and you can't run a mile in 4 minutes anymore, or 5 minutes, or whatever it is. You know, you just sort of accept it. This is just the way it is. I have a certain acceptance, call it resignation, but it's basically acceptance of that. This is the way things work. This is the way power is handled in the world, and pretty much always has been. But then you have this other thing, and these ferocious, fierce, venal, cynical lies designed, you know, Adolf Hitler, designed to, you know, illegitimately and with no basis in truth, gain power and gain all this influence over people. And of course, you know, as Lincoln said, you can fool some of the people all of the time. And if some of the people means 50 or 60 million of the people, you got a problem. And you get a very polarized country. And one half is living in this reality that has, you know, some factual basis to it, you know, some sort of scientific underpinning, something that you could stand. And then you got this completely alternative reality. And I don't think any political system is equipped to handle that. And that's where it gets really, really dicey right now. And to me, and I think, you know, at some point, people who are sane are in the majority. They certainly have the majority of the spending power. Voting can be pretty manipulated, as we've seen. I mean, voter suppression, we see what the GOP is trying to do. We've seen what Democrats have done. I mean, you know, you're harder on the Democrats than I am, but I'll admit they've done their share of, you know, putting their thumbs on the scales, not against the GOP, but against their own, you know, progressives. but the GOP is really pulling out all the stops now. So voting may not be the conduit that we've always assumed, and the vector that we've always assumed to, democratic expression, small d. Maybe spending is. Toyota just, I don't remember if it was Axios. I think it was Axios. It might have been ProPublica. One of those, we have these really good groups out there, flawed, some of them, but basically good, digging up stuff. And maybe it was Crew, CREW. I'm not sure. One of those organizations came out with a big reveal that Toyota had been contributing rather significantly. I mean, not billions, it's tens of thousands of dollars, but it's symbolic to these Republican congressional people who had basically supported the insurrection or voted against, even after the storming of the Capitol, had voted against the certification of the electors. From the Toyota boardroom, you could see they were shaking in their boots. They were trying to rationalize, justify, whatever. But they just lost more, and I would not be surprised, because I mean, Toyota is a big, Prius is their big brand. Who buys Priuses? Liberals. I mean, they just lost more in business. I mean, they spend 10, 15 years cultivating a brand, and they might have just lost half of it. So if you could actually coordinate and organize the spending patterns of the sane majority, the silent majority, the sane majority, whatever you want to call them, us, it would have a tremendous amount of power. And in fact, you could, I think, given the popularity of some of the progressive causes right now, you could get a tremendous amount of, boycott power. It doesn't have to be boycotting a specific company. It could be just, we're not buying anything. We're not buying anything we don't need for a month. Take that. And boardrooms, corporate boardrooms, they lose 0.5% on their bottom line, and the axe starts falling. They're really panicking. So we really do have that power. It's consumer capitalism, and this country runs on that. That's the gasoline that runs the engine. And if we ever got that organized and coordinated, it would be a tremendous, power in our hands. Short of that, what do? You try to make the elections not grossly unfair, and you try to, this is basically blue tsunami. You try to get turnout to overcome the various thumbs that are on the scale. In the long run, I mean, I've always said that's got to be a losing game in the long run, because if you control the spigot that the pipe that the votes have to go through, you can just keep choking it and choking it and choking it down. I don't know what happens. I don't know what happens in 2022. I'm assuming we're not going to see federal legislation like S1, HR1. It looks pretty much dead in the water. Whatever does come out will probably be pretty ineffectual, I'm guessing. But maybe a little bit of federal legislation, some lawsuits, both by the DOJ and by groups like Marilyn Marx's, group in Georgia, obviously groups in North Carolina and Texas, Arizona, Florida, et cetera, that are challenging these laws that are very repressive, it's not even so much, the requiring voter ID and shortening periods of early voting. Those are highly selectively inconvenient. But scarier than that are these clauses tucked away, 17 paragraphs down, that basically say if the state legislature doesn't like the results, they can change them. I mean, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but they can get rid of county administrators and election administrators and they can put in their own stooge, and they can overcome, the stuff they were trying to pull in Texas, where the Democrats, finally grew a spine and a brain at the same time, and walked out and managed to make that stick temporarily. That bill was just absolutely horrific. And, these bills are coming from not the legislators themselves. They're not that smart. These are coming from the Heritage Foundation. They used to come from ALEC. These are right-wing, far right-wing think tanks that are templating this legislation and trying to squeeze them in everywhere, including places like Virginia, which we're now regarding as sort of a blue state. But, they are still, there is possibilities in these places of getting this very, very dangerous legislation passed. Virginia's not high on the list of danger because of its political makeup now, but one election down the road, that could all change. We saw in Wisconsin and Michigan and places like that. So it is really, it's total war. It's basically total war. There's nothing moral or ethical or anything about it at this point. It's basically, we want our voters to vote and your voters not to be able to vote. And if that doesn't work, we want to be able to alter the results of the election in one way or another. I don't know where all this is going. It's scary. Usually the center holds. We saw that in 2020 by an eyelash.
We didn't see it in 2020. Let's assume that the data anomalies you suggested, 27 out of 27, and in our previous interview, that reflect that basically, and I think this is true, the Republican manipulated election didn't want King Trump. It's not that they didn't keep the election or had hands off in a manipulating election. They just said, we'll win some Senate races, we'll win a whole bunch of House races and state legislatures, let Trump go bye-bye, and then we'll install a permanent floating Republican president 4 years from now.
Yeah, that's very possible. When I say the center held, and by an eyelash, I just mean that we didn't wind up in civil war, on January 7th. But we are in trouble. And I totally, I agree with you that might very well have been the scenario. What they needed to do, they couldn't afford a 13 million vote beat down in the presidential popular vote. That was going to be really bad for the party brand. So they had to mitigate that. At the same time, I think I agree with you. Most of them personally despise Trump for very good reasons, and probably had very little interest in seeing him, reelected to be the president, particularly since they knew they were going to be able to basically castrate Biden. So, maybe with Biden's, depending on how you look at Biden, maybe Biden pulled his own pants down and said, here, come get me. But, whatever you think about that, they had to know, the smart money, the Mitch McConnells had to know that Biden wasn't really going anywhere with the Senate the way it is. Yes, pick off some state legislatures, pick off some more House seats, set yourself up to take over again in 2022, write some more laws, put in your president of choice, Rick DeSantis in 2024. We're in trouble. The center held only in the sense that, that people weren't, for the most part, shooting at each other. But yeah, it would be very hard to, crystal ball it and oracle it and say this specifically this or specifically that is going to happen. But I do think that we're, what's left of the guardrails are pretty splintered at this point. And, I don't have a prescription. I don't have, okay, we'll just do this and everything will be fine. I'm waiting to see what comes out of Arizona. I'm hoping that it's not what I'm afraid it's going to be. And, then you kind of take it from there. If S1 is not passed, and that is looking increasingly likely, almost certain at this point, then you're looking at, state by state attrition, you're looking at DOJ involvement. For most people, that's very eye glazing. How many people, if you're not getting paid for it, can really keep track of what's going on in 20 different states, God knows how many counties. There was a fascinating article in Politico by Ben Wofford. It was basically a profile of Matthew Caulfield, who was the Wharton whiz kid, now an assistant professor, very young guy, who basically, started looking into, from a business perspective, something that we had always been dropping hints about, but really didn't have the chops to look into, which is, how does this voting equipment industry run? And it is the most secretive industry. We know way more about Raytheon and Halliburton and Blackwater, for that matter, than we know about ES&S and Dominion and Hart and all their various satellites, and how they actually work their business model. It is tremendously opaque. And so we don't know, it's as far from a public trust as you can possibly get. And how do you get a handle on that, especially in a tight time frame, and especially when you're fighting off all these offensives and initiatives that are designed to make sure people stand online for 8 hours without water, that people have trouble requesting or delivering a mail-in ballot, that people can't find drop boxes, that they're forced to vote on ballot marking devices as opposed to hand marked paper ballots, that there's so many things, and that when the results finally come in, if the state legislature, the Secretary of State or something doesn't like them, they have all these new powers to basically overturn elections, in the run up to the election, to change the administration of it. If they don't like what the administrator, somebody like Raffensperger, for instance, in Georgia, is doing, they can remove them or change them or strip their powers. Elections boards and at the county level, they can remove them and appoint somebody of their own political persuasion. This is a coordinated, templated, and absolutely ferocious attack on the way our elections are being administered, which was not good to begin with. But this is really dangerous. And when you couple that with, a voting equipment universe and industry that is really totally mysterious and unaccountable, and you don't know exactly what their motivations are, or who has access, or who has the inside track to these things, foreign or domestic, that's a real recipe for trouble. And that's probably where we're headed. Which will keep us relevant. People will be interested in elections. I think that's a guarantee. There was a period there in our country where elections were real yawners. Think of Carter Ford, for instance, Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford. It's like, well, this guy wins, that guy wins, whatever, and people didn't even know what the lineup in Congress was, let alone their state legislatures. The vast majority of people had virtually no scope of knowledge when it came to these nuts and bolts. Now that it's more on the radar, and that's about the only good thing I can say. Unfortunately, it's on the radar in such a way that 50 or 60 million people are ready to go out, with their guns and march to Washington, because the whole thing is stop the steal. It's very, very twisted. It's very ironic. It's really surrealistic. We sort of saw it coming, and we kind of predicted it. In some of my writing, and Emily Levy of Scrutineers also, put her finger on this. We're basically saying that election, quote unquote, election integrity, and election forensics are sitting around like a loaded gun, waiting for somebody to pick it up with bad intent. And that's exactly what we saw happen. And, you know, we did predict in the advance of the election that Trump was not going to accept defeat. If he was defeated, he was either going to, you know, be the beneficiary of a rigged victory, or if it was insufficient or didn't happen and he lost, that he was not going to let go, and that we were going to see all sorts of challenges to the function of, you know, basic rule of law, democracy, whatever you want to call it. And in that, we were accurate. The fact that it has become the peg in the sand that is dividing the two parties at this point, and certainly dividing, I don't know, it's hard to say where some of the Democrats really are on this because they don't seem, you know, entirely engaged in this battle, but dividing two wings of this country, if not the parties themselves, and that you've had so much buy-in from the GOP to the point where they've basically exiled anybody that is not willing to go, Heil Trump, your election was stolen. This I didn't see coming, and I don't think anybody really did. And hats off to them if they did. But this is a whole new, you know, level of this video game. You know, we're now on level 8. And I'm, you know, I'm hoping for the best. I do think that there's a lot of good people. I do think that there's a lot of gravitas to a country like ours. It's not a banana republic yet. But, you know, I wouldn't want to be handicapping this horse race in terms of whether it goes completely off the rails, partly off the rails, or somehow manages to get back on the rails, or gets better in such a way that we learn from all this crap and actually have public observable vote counting, elections we can trust, get money the hell out of elections, get rid of the gerrymandering. I mean, there's so many things we could do. If we were starting with a tabula rasa and we were being rational about it, and we really wanted a democracy, there's so many things we could do. And, you know, again, if the cost of those things is a few $1 billion, well, you know, hey, our military budget is what, 800 billion, not counting the CIA, 900 billion. I mean, my God, we could certainly afford it. And, you know, that we're not doing them is a very bad look, and it's a very bad sign in terms of, you know, playing fast and loose with things that really, really matter.
Well, I mean, I can't really sum it up better than that. That's where we are. You know, I think, you know, we say I'm harder on Democrats than you are. It's just that when they said we will do, their view is, one side is like, we'll do anything to win, and the other side is like, we will do anything to win except repeal a bureaucratic change from 1975. Okay.
Yeah, no, I know it's.
I mean, is it because the no talk filibuster, the 60 vote requirement goes back to 1975? And I wrote an article. I'm like, does anyone think from 1975 to 2021 is the golden age of legislation?
Our golden years. Yeah, no, I mean, you're right. I mean, it's crazy. And again, you have to suspect that in a way. I mean, when Manchin's an interesting guy. I mean, Sinema, I don't get Sinema. You know, I don't know where she's coming from or who's behind her or what. But Manchin's an interesting guy, and where he's come from and how he's formed his, you know, his beliefs and stuff. But from what I hear, you know, they are not the only ones opposed to making this change. I mean, they're basically, you know, carrying the ball for 6 or 7 other senators. I don't get it. I really don't get it, because their thinking seems to be, and, you know, check my logic, their thinking seems to be, all right, we won't do away with the filibuster because eventually the Republicans are going to get back in control. And when they do, we want to have the filibuster so that we can keep them from running roughshod over our agenda, right? And the things we believe in.
But that's not even what Manchin thinks. Because Manchin, did you hear the leaked audio? Or did you see accept the leaked audio?
That was more Sinema's line.
That's what Sinema says. That's what Sinema says.
Yeah, Sinema says that. But again, I mean, you know, and other people may believe that. But then you look at it and you say, you actually believe that when the Republicans take over, they're going to say, oh, let's honor this sacred tradition of the filibuster and keep it in place so the Democrats can, stop us from doing anything. You got to be kidding. I mean, unless that was, even if it were signed in Mitch McConnell's blood, I wouldn't believe that. So, you're basically forfeiting the only opportunity you have to make a fundamental core level change in processes, which would come with the For the People Act and the John Lewis Act, et cetera, maybe something even a little stronger than that. Not to mention pass all this other legislation that could actually give you a chance of looking like you were, governmentally successful and therefore getting reelected. So you're gonna forfeit all of that, go into 2022 and 2024, with the thought that if we get knocked out of power, we'll use the filibuster. I mean, it just doesn't pass the laugh test. So I don't know
No,
what
it doesn't. But Manchin said it pretty plainly in the leaked audio, at least in the excerpts. He basically said, paraphrasing, "Hey, Mr. Billionaires, I'm looking like an idiot out here trying to protect the filibuster, which you guys want, saying Republicans are reasonable when they're not being reasonable. So can you help me look less like an idiot so I can keep doing what you want me to do?" Paraphrase, but not much. That's not a big paraphrase. That's not.
Yeah.
I'm just putting the words together in different order, really.
I mean, I'm a rather dyed-in-the-wool atheist, but every now and then I have conversations with the God that I don't believe exists, just because you have to keep talking. You have to keep the dialogue with the cosmos going. And the only thing I can think of this, a lot of times, I mean, it's so ridiculous that it just feels like a bad script being written, by that graduate student in the sky doing an experiment with all our psyches. And yes, it's probably a bad script being written by some combination of the deep state, Putin, billionaires, God knows what. I don't know. I'm not that much of a believer in, the coordinating abilities of the Bill Gateses and George Soroses and whatever of the world. I don't go really very far in that direction at all. But it just has the feel of, oh my God. So we have this Senate quote unquote majority, and we got Joe Manchin. But then when I go back to my atheist self and stop thinking about the script being written in the sky, I realized that what we really have is we have a constitutional system that was put in place fundamentally by a bunch of rich white men, fundamentally by elitists with a lot of good, if somewhat fuzzy thoughts about power to the people in a limited sort of a way, but with certainly not any ability, and it's no blame to them, to be able to see 250 years or whatever into the future and recognize, what the demographic, geographic, and political situation of this country and the world as a whole is going to be at that point. What we have is we have a Senate in which obviously small states are grossly overrepresented. I mean, Wyoming, to take the most extreme example, has the same representation of California with 1/40th of the population. I think I got the numbers right. It might be even smaller than that. So what that translates to is that half the population of this country is represented by 17 senators, and the other half is represented by 83 senators. Now, we, as blue staters in our blue state bubbles, we're the ones that are represented by 17 senators. The red states have a gross overrepresentation. It is something of a miracle that Democrats can even come close to even terms in the Senate. And I submit that the only reason they can come close is that the Republicans are so nakedly the party of the 1% at this point. They are so abysmal at governing, so just destructive when it comes to everything from our environment to things that people care about, to the economic well-being of their own constituents. You know, not accepting Medicaid, knocking off the benefits and all this stuff. They are governing so abysmally and so much for the plutocratic class that the Democrats have a political lifeline, a political chance. And then you throw in a lead balloon like Trump and look at the 2018 election, and how much in the House, at least, the Democrats gained, because that election was basically a referendum on Trump and impeachment and all that. But structurally, it is a table that is tilted at something close to a 45-degree angle, and all the balls are rolling to one side. And the Senate, unless we have a constitutional convention, which ironically, the far right wants a constitutional convention so they can basically turn this into a white supremacist fascist dictatorship. We're not the ones, belly aching for a constitutional convention, but in the absence of a constitutional convention, and even if the filibuster were done away with, the structural imbalance in the Senate is so great that it really is, absolutely uphill both ways for the Democrats. And it does explain a bit of why you get Manchins. Because if you didn't have Manchin, you'd have another Shelley Moore Capito. You'd have another far-right Republican senator from West Virginia. And then Mitch McConnell would have his corner office back. And, not a hell of a lot would change except for the fact that there'd be even more, fascist judges on the court, on the federal courts. So, West Virginia is West Virginia. Now, if the West Virginians are showing a certain maybe sign of waking up to how much they're being screwed, and maybe they'll, get it that maybe renewable energy will somehow can be made to work out for them and whatnot. But they're still a long way from becoming, Rhode Island or Maryland or Delaware or California. So, and they got the two senators, and so does Idaho, and so does Wyoming, and so does Alabama, and so does Mississippi, and blah, blah, blah. There are a lot of these red states, the Dakotas and Nebraska and Kansas and all that, and Oklahoma. And they're going to make it so that the Republicans, if they don't absolutely self-destruct, which is not out of the question, they certainly seem to be, flirting with it. But if they don't absolutely self-destruct, they basically have a lock on somewhere between 45 and 55 senators at minimum. You do away with the filibuster, and yeah, you might actually do some good things during this very brief window. But the structural cards are really marked here, and that's our Constitution. It affects the Electoral College as well.
So there's a Constitution. I mean, basically, our Constitution was set up like an update to the Magna Carta. It was like, we don't want a king. We want all the wealthy white men to have a say in government. So which is better than a king. It's better than a king, but it was not written for the people. It was written to level the playing field among all the wealthy white men.
That is correct. And basically make wealthy white men with disparate interests buy in by giving them, the Southern wealthy white man a lifeline.
It was to protect the white men, all the wealthy white men across the country who can say, this is fair. This is fair for us.
Yeah.
But I'm saying, you said Manchin, but I'm not leaving Sinema or these 10 Democrats and Biden too. They don't want to do any of the things they campaigned on. Not a single one. I mean, maybe there are Democrats who do, but there's these 10 senators, there's Kamala Harris, there's Biden, who don't want to overrule the parliamentarian to the fight for 15. You mentioned Republican ruthlessness. Like when they got stymied on tax cuts, trying to use, budget reconciliation, they fired the fucker. Hey, parliamentarian, you defy us? Not only are we going to overrule you, which we could just overrule you, but no, we're going to do more than that. We're firing you and sending you a message to the next person who takes the job. because they know if they say no to us, we'll fire them too.
I mean,
Yeah,
and
I mean,
so, yeah.
ruthlessness, obviously there's a ruthless gene, and you know, it seems to be, I don't know, it's hereditary in the Republicans, whatever it is. I don't know. I mean, trying to figure out, you know, I do think my personal belief, no real great evidentiary basis for this, but my personal belief is that Biden probably is very much keeping in mind his legacy, and he really does want to somehow bring the country together and all that stuff. I do not think he's just a tool of the corporations. But as with Obama, I think there's definitely some lines drawn that they're aware of that they're not able or supposed to cross. It would take a massive profile and courage to cross some of those lines. Power has a way. I mean, whether it's in an autocratic system or a nominally democratic system, power has a way of getting its way. It always has. And, you know, it's the exception to the rule when, for more than a very brief, you know, revolutionary interval, whether that's 1789 or, you know, 1917, the people actually distribute power in a way that is not correlated with existing power bases and just perpetuating those or increasing their power. It's really rare. And in fact, you know, those developments have not generally historically been stable. I mean, we have gone through some periods in this country where at least there was sort of the illusion. But I think that it was mostly illusion. I mean, I think power has always had its way in this country. And it's usually you know, even with something like the New Deal, I mean, they're the first one to the teller window. I don't know how you get around that. I don't know. I'm not enough of I don't know what the field even is, social psychologist, philosopher, sociologist, Lord of the Flies. I don't know. I don't know to what extent in large organizations it's possible to maintain an equilibrium that has as its, you know, defining characteristic a kind of egalitarianism. I mean, John Rawls came out with a theory of justice. This is, you know, what, about 30 years ago.
Yeah, I you mentioned before, everyone got around together and said, well, if we didn't know how people were born, what would we want to be the system for everybody?
Right, exactly. This veil of ignorance, and the idea would be, you know, if you didn't, as you said, if you didn't know how this Constitution or this legislation or these rules would affect you, if you didn't know what your position was, you were blind, basically blinded. You know, what would you come up with? And his what he came up with the people in a position like that would have a tendency to be he called it maximinning, which is to say that they would go for the maximum floor they could get, so that they wouldn't fall below. It would be in everybody's interest not to be crushed, not to be on the bottom of the heap. And since you didn't know whether you were going to be a top dog or a bottom dog, you would choose to have the bottom dog be as well off as you could set this system up to be. And so it would bring everything kind of towards a place of not strict egalitarianism, but one in which the extremes were mitigated. And you know, that's what people would do from the position of the veil of ignorance. Unfortunately, there's no way to enforce a veil of ignorance. People very much know what position they're in. And we've seen that they absolutely operate from that position, not based, I mean, if anything, you can measure, I mean, John Rawls' theory of justice is interesting because not so much as a prescriptive, because we're never going to see the veil of ignorance, but by measuring the distance of how far your culture is from that original position in terms of how it behaves, how it constructs its laws and its structure and its legislation. And right now, it's very, very obvious. The tax bill being a perfect example. I mean, people are writing laws and making procedures. An even better example, voter suppression. How do we make the rules around voting? We make them in such a way that our side wins because your side can't vote. That is as far from the veil of ignorance as you could possibly get. And that goes a long way to explaining why we're in trouble, because there isn't even the pretense at this point of principled or ethical or, you know, a sense of equity prevailing. It's how do we advance the interests of our side, period. And doing it with full awareness of how anything you do is going to impact your wealth and your power, your prospects of election, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where we're at. And, you know, that's not all that far from Hobbes, you know, which was what Rawls was kind of in a way trying to answer and trying to correct. And, you know, it's a great ideal. And we've really drifted.
Well, I've got, let me just finish up because, so first off, I think like you said about like, you know, one side can't vote, like the veil of ignorance. When Georgia deliberately put paperless voting machines that you couldn't recount. And I said, you would never do that if you didn't know the fix was in for your side. Because again, the veil of ignorance, you have no way of knowing who actually won the election. No one would put themselves in that position as a politician unless you knew how it was going to break out.
Yeah, we've been making that argument all along. We've been saying when Mitch McConnell and Bob Ney and Blunt, Roy Blunt, you know, ginned up Hava, that
Wait, no, but that's
never
electronic
do
ones.
that from the veil of ignorance. You'd never.
But that's electronic ones that could have a paper trail.
Yeah.
Georgia specifically had no paper trail. There was no ability whatsoever to recount. Statewide, not even just some counties. Statewide, Georgia became the tabula rasa, the mystery box, the black box of democracy.
Yep.
And for
it went Republican.
Years,
I mean, it basically on a dime, it went Republican. Now, some of that was demographic, you know, organic change. But
no,
again,
but
as you say, why would they put this in if they didn't feel that they had the inside track to control?
It's Big Julie and Guys and Dolls removing the spots on the dice for luck.
Yeah.
But don't worry, he remembers where they are.
I remember where they are.
10. Yeah. At least you get the hard points.
7. Snake eyes.
And the last thing I'm going to say is when I stopped believing in Rawls. I'm a stand-up comic by hobby, and occasionally I perform actually like shows and produce shows. But you know, you go to open mics, and I went to an open mic at Flappers, which is in Burbank, California, at like 11:30 p.m. and they had so many people there that they, you know, because you get 3-minute spots and it's done by lottery, it's all random. And they said, if we do the lottery, about half of you won't go up. But if we do 2-minute spots instead of 3-minute spots, all of you will go up. And so we're going to put it to a vote. Do you want everyone to get 2-minute spots, or half the people have 3-minute spots? And I'm like, this is John Rawls. This is the veil of ignorance.
Yeah.
And of course, I voted for 2 minutes, as you might expect, being, you know, egalitarian, better for all. How do you think the vote went?
I'm guessing that the lottery prevailed.
90%. I was like one of 2 people with their hands up. And I really thought about this. Like, to me, that was like revelatory. Yeah. I'm like, this is society. Now, I wonder is if this was someplace like Wisconsin, as opposed to California, with like a less of a me first vibe, more community oriented, would the vote have been different if it wasn't stand-up comics who are obviously egocentric?
I don't know. I'm surprised. I mean, the only organic reason I can think of is that people had prepared 3-minute spiels, and they either wanted to go out there and do their 3-minute thing or not go at all, as opposed to having to reconstruct and take out half their material, a third of their material. That would make some sort of sense, because ordinarily, if that were not a factor, I would just think that 90% would vote for the 2 minutes, because it makes more sense. It's the Rawls vote, and so that they didn't makes me think that, okay, well, I got 3 minutes of material. They've timed it out to the split second. I don't know that much about stand-up. I mean,
that's an argument, and people present that to me all the time to rebut my theory. People present that, but having done open mics where it's fairly improvisational, it could be valid,
yeah,
but I don't think it is. I think it's that people would rather take a chance on getting more
yeah,
than guarantee everybody gets some.
yeah. Well, and and the thing with the elections is we don't even think it's taking a chance. I mean, I think we're in agreement that what they did is a very good sign. It's another freestanding piece of evidence that the fix has been in for a long time, because they went to a place where they really couldn't verify anything, and the only way you'd sit comfortably with that is if you thought it broke in your favor, and that you weren't going to be like screaming and scratching your head and saying, how could we lose this? And then we have the evidence that they just kept winning, starting with Max Cleland in Georgia. And, in 2002, they knocked off an incumbent paraplegic who was, he was ahead by 7, 8 points in the polls. He was popular, and all of a sudden he loses by 6 points. That was right after those machines were installed, and they've never looked, until 2020, they never looked back. So I don't know what's happening in Georgia now. I mean, I find we probably don't have time for this today, but I'm really scratching my head over what is actually going on in Georgia. And they're still repressing the hell out of the vote. But how did they let,
They had one election that was fair in 20 years, and they're like, well, this isn't fun.
Yeah. But I mean, again, I could understand Trump losing. I could understand because, as you said, the poobahs probably were not behind him. But when it came time for McConnell to lose his Senate, leadership, which I assume he prized extremely, at a high value, how they managed to let that happen, I still don't know.
They got rid of all the paperless machines, and they didn't do it.
They got rid of paperless machines. They still had BMDs. They still had, there was a lot of scrutiny. They had international observers, and by the time January, whenever that election was, January 5th, right, rolled around, there was tremendous focus. And then, of course, Trump, decided to go down there and have this rally or whatever and make it all about him, and that put the final nail in their coffins. I mean, there were a couple of lousy candidates too.
Well, everyone's like Brian Kemp and Ratzenberger, heroes of democracy. I'm like, they're not.
No, they're not.
At best, and they didn't choose to be paperless, to have paper backups. They fought in court constantly to not have paper backups, and they lost.
Yeah, the heroes there,
yeah,
Marilyn Marks, Garland Favorito, people like that, and Stacey Abrams.
But all the most that they did, the most that you can see out of Georgia is that they did not overturn the results for Trump. And I think if McConnell had called them and said, hey, we've decided Trump's our guy, they would have. But he said, no, we don't want King Trump. We want a rotating permanent Republican presidency, not the Trump dynasty.
Yeah,
so sit out a year.
I think you're probably right about that. I mean, I do think, there was a lot of personal animosity, real hatred of Trump on a personal level there and in other quarters as well. John Roberts is another one that, they hated him, and with very good reason. He is a despicable human being. And even to a dyed-in-the-wool Republican, he's a despicable human being who, helped get their taxes cut. But any Republican president I mean, you could have put Mike Pence in there. You could have put, anybody. You could have put any Republican in 2016, and they would
No,
have got
no,
more
but
votes.
I mean, like, if Trump had won, it wouldn't have been Republican victory. He would have ran in 2024. He would have maybe rewrote the Constitution to run in 2028. He would have had Ivanka go in 2032.
Oh yeah,
How
he
does
was
that serve?
they were
Yeah,
never leaving. No, I agree with you. I don't think they were in it for Trump. I do think they needed to mitigate his popular vote loss. And I think that's one thing we didn't get into, but I have that scatter plot. We might have even touched upon that last time, but
we did last time.
yeah, that scatter plot, and it suggests there were a lot of ballots that went uncounted or uncast for Democrats in heavy Democratic areas. And that really cut into Biden's popular vote victory. I don't think the Republican Party as a brand could have dealt with a 12, 13 million vote popular vote loss. So they were going to mitigate it, but I don't think they were going to, certainly not bend over backwards to put him back in the White House. And I suspect you're right, they didn't want him.
No, but these
Which
heroes
is
of
one reason
democracy.
why he was so pissed off.
But the Dems in the media were like, Kemp and Ratzenberger, what character, what heroes of democracy?
The Medal of Honor and all that.
And then a month later, they're like, how can we stop people from voting? These
Yep.
heroes of democracy, a month later, are like, well, no votes here anymore.
I know. Yeah, just get rid of these 364,000. We'll be back in control. Yeah, it's. Ugh. I mean, the cynicism really knows no bounds, and it's been tough. I mean, for people who know me, you can probably tell I look pretty tired, and I'm in great physical shape. I'm a soccer referee at pretty high levels, and I work out and I run and I referee. High level soccer is a lot of running. 6-7 miles of running per game, and I do trail running and I do swimming and I do therotubing workouts. I'm in good shape that way, but I look at myself in the mirror and I'm like, oh dear God, because I have aged, really tremendously in the past few years. Just gotten, I don't know what it is, but worn down, really worn down, because it's a lot to carry when you care. It'd be nice if you could just shut that switch off and say, screw it, and I'm just going to care about, the woods next to my house or the butterflies, or they're dying off too. But that's the thing. It's politics. It's not so much affecting me financially all that much. That's not the issue. It's everything around. It's watching the lies, watching the grossness and the unfairness, and watching the environment and the climate, and just seeing that this is truly our, I sound like a politician, but truly our chance to be better. And we're so bogged down in this morass. It's just a terrible morass of fear and selfishness and greed and anger and resentment and lies. And, it takes its toll. I mean, do you have a spring in your step? Yeah, when I'm refereeing, I get to focus on that match, and that's 2 hours that I can control, or I have a lot of control over, and I have a spring in my step. But when I wake up in the morning, or I get on my computer, or I pick, tune in NPR, or I look at, the Twitter and whatever, really, it's often all I can do not to just, duck back under the covers and say, just go away. And that's really, that was Yeats in his coming from the right wing, but it's universally applicable in the poem that he wrote in 1921, the best lack all conviction while the worst are full of passion and intensity. And, I wouldn't say we lack all conviction, but I know for me, I feel like I'm carrying a big weight, and it makes me want to, put my head under the pillow and say, I've done all I can, I've done enough. And yet you get these Marjorie Taylor Greens and DeSantis's and Abbott's and Hawley's and Tucker Carlson's and Mike Lindell's, and they just seem to be Energizer bunnies, just filled with all sorts of passion. And then these people that, you know, trail behind them and are ready to go Heil. It is Yeats. It's basically, you know, it's literally 100 years ago he wrote that poem, The Second Coming. And that
Right.
line,
Yeah.
you know,
I mean, yeah. Turning and turning in the widening gyre.
yep.
And it's true. I mean, well, I don't want to go too far into it, but I think what weighs on you is knowledge. You've tasted from the tree of knowledge and been kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Is that it's not like Belarus or Russia where people know they're living in a dictatorship, but you have evidence. Let's just say you have strong evidence, statistical evidence that we've been living in a soft dictatorship for 20 years and no one will listen to you.
Yep.
I mean, and that's a burden, both that no one will listen to you and that you know that our elections have not been represented. Well, not no, but you have strong evidence that our elections have been rigged.
Yep.
And no, and so everyone's like, oh, happy we're the land of the free. And you're like, not for the last 20 years, we're not.
Yeah. And then,
Although,
you know, you have these people going out there and screaming, stop the steal, and saying it was a sacred landslide. And I mean, you know, without any evidence at all, nothing in the polls, nothing anywhere to suggest that that's true, and feeling tremendously energized, you know, storming the Capitol. That's full of a passion and intensity. And I wouldn't say we lack all conviction, but we do feel there is a certain sense of inevitable, you know, fighting the good battle, fighting the long defeat. And that's not a very energizing place to be. That's a place where you say, all right, you know, grit your teeth and march on, do whatever you can, but it's not with any, you know, there's not a lot of cheer in it. And I don't know, personally, that's where I've been mired. I mean, I know other people who are not necessarily, but you know, that's more or less where I've been. And I guess, you know, I have not stopped working. I don't think my output is what it once was, but I believe in the middle way. And, you know, I believe that something is better than nothing, and you do what you can do and stay healthy. So I'm planning a update, a new edition of Code Red, probably, you know, early next year. And meanwhile, I'll have a paper out. I'll see who publishes it, that I sent you, you know, an early draft of, trying to sort out some of the things that happened in 2020, you know, for the historical record, if nothing else, and, you know, put some balance into this whole period, this very, you know, fraught and frankly very Yahoo period that we've stumbled into. And, you know, I hope that turns out to have some value.
Well, I mean, it's like Marjorie Taylor Greene. She serves the corporate interests. She serves the interests of power. So there's lots of money to fund her, and she gets more money the crazier she is.
Yep. They're rolling in dough right now. Those Yahoos. I got to tell you, they're raking it in. I mean, the thing, it really does kill me. This convergence and this overlap, intersection, intertwining, you know, of the corporate agenda with this culture war, and how they managed to pull that off and turn basically the profit motive and what the corporations want into this paradoxical mobilization of the very people that those corporations are screwing, to support the same politicians that are serving the corporate interest. I mean, that to me, you know, whether it's Lakoff and messaging or whatever it is that's made that possible or that they've done, that is so grievous to see. You know, it would be one thing if we're just a pure culture war and we're white supremacists or whatever, but it's in the service of these deep pocket corporations that basically want, you know, whatever system leaves them fat and happy and unregulated and untouched. You know, whether it's Amazon or it's whatever, Boeing or Kellogg Brown and Root, they all basically want the same thing. and they just don't want us to get in their way. And right now they're doing an amazing job of some sort of alliance with religious forces, quote unquote religious, evangelical, and these culture, warriors. And it's turning America just absolutely plug ugly. So I hope we find a way of, of recognizing that, countering it where we can. We are to some extent, but it's an awful alliance, and it's really an ugly thing to behold.
Well, have you read What's the Matter with Kansas by Tom Frank?
I've read summary of it. I have not actually read the book, but I know the thesis.
Well, I mean, I think it's real. I mean, it is real. And like I wrote just an article about how much the financial industry and insurance industries donated to Biden in 2020. Is that, you have the reason the cultural wars work is you have a pro-corporate, pro-gay rights party, and you have a pro-corporate, anti-gay rights party.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, is that
I won't argue with you there.
You don't have a pro-labor party. You have the less hostile to labor party, but that doesn't get you out in the streets. Like, like you have a preference about someone who's going to cut off your arm versus someone who's going to cut off your leg, but you're not going to go march in the streets for the person who's going to cut off your arm or over the cut who's going to cut off your leg. And so when you take out the labor, then what do you have to choose? The difference between the two parties is one tells you it's okay to hate people, and one says be nice. And hate is more mobilizing than be nice. If the Democrats, we keep coming back to this. They dropped the fight for 15, which they could have, because the Senate parliamentarian said no. That's all it took.
Yeah.
People got killed by the police to fight for unionization. And Democrats, after they turned out in Georgia, stood 10 hours in line, they couldn't overrule the Senate parliamentarian. And Biden didn't say, hey, we're gonna, like, Kamala, why'd you do that? I really wanted you to overrule the parliamentarian. None of them, except for Bernie Sanders, made a stink about it because they're pro-corporate. They get huge money from corporations. Corporations didn't want to fight for 15. So, whether they took the Senate parliamentarian aside and said, we want you to say no on this, or they just said, well, if it wasn't that, we would have come up with some other reason to take it out. And so who's gonna stand in line for 10 hours for Dems after they wouldn't overrule the parliamentarian?
Yeah, I mean, I really got no argument back at that. I agree with you there. I don't know. I mean, what made them stand in line in 2018 and 2020 was how, vile and reprehensible Trump was. That's what really brought out these Democratic voters. And, he may continue to bring out Democratic voters, as opposed to, these policy issues, even important policy issues, which people have a tendency to just sort of, forget or get mixed up about. I mean, Trump was tremendously motivating. I don't know what happens, next. I don't know what happens in his absence, but I do agree with you that,
unions endorsed Biden because he said fight for 15. I mean, yes, because he also wasn't Trump, but he said it. It was central to his campaign, just like I'll send you 2K. And did they send 2K? No, they sent 1,400. I know the math, but what a huge public relations error. Like, for $600, you shot yourself in the foot. Like, you could have had a layup and you tripped. And and that's not that I don't buy coincidences. What's the James Bond line? Once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, 3 times is enemy action. 1,400 instead of 2,000, that's happenstance. The Senate parliamentarian, okay, that's coincidence. Not even saying in public we need to get rid of the filibuster, that's enemy action. I've taken 2 hours of your time, and I will post this on YouTube. And once I post it, if you see any things that make good excerpts, because I think 30 seconds and 2-minute videos are more like people's attention span. So let me know what you think is good markouts, and I'll make excerpts. All right, thanks for the interview. I really appreciate your time.
Doug, thank you. Thank you as well. I really enjoyed talking to you as well.